There is a strange and dangerous vulnerability underground, sinkholes.
Across America, foundations are being tested in very different ways. Water is retreating from Lake Mead, exposing a rusted shipwreck that had remained hidden for decades. At the same time, the ground itself has given way in Florida, where the surroundings have been pulled downward as the land collapses inward. In the Midwest, an unusually severe winter storm has swept through Missouri, driving cold deep into regions unaccustomed to prolonged freezes. And in quiet churches, familiar statues appear to shift just enough to unsettle those watching. These stories never share a headline, but timing connects them. When so many supports are being adjusted at once, the question is unavoidable. What do they truly mean? Before we continue, like this video, share your thoughts, and subscribe, because what's unfolding may matter more than we realize. Across the American Southwest, a symbolic scene continues to take shape. Lake Mead, once a lifeline for millions, has receded to levels not seen since the 1930s. Prolonged drought and rising heat have drawn the shoreline steadily inward, leaving behind a stark, chalky bathtub ring etched high along canyon walls. Sun-bleached rock, cracked sediment, and long-buried debris now dominate a landscape that was once defined by water. As the lake withdraws, objects sealed beneath its surface for decades are revealed. Among them, a corroded shipwreck rests on exposed ground, its hull tilted and rusting in open air. The vessel did not break apart in a storm. It was not destroyed by force. The water simply left, and in leaving, it exposed what time had already weakened. These ships once moved with purpose. They carried people, supported labor, and reflected confidence in continuity. Now they sit still on dry earth, unable to float, because the conditions that sustained them are gone. The water did not ruin them, it uncovered them. What once appeared dependable is shown to be fragile when the supporting element recedes. At the same time, other parts of the country experience the opposite extreme. While Lake Mead continues to contract, distant regions contend with persistent inundation, winter storms, sudden surges, and water pressing beyond familiar bounds. In one place, water withdraws. In another, it overwhelms. The contrast is striking. The same element revealing vulnerability through absence in one region and through excess in another. Scripture often frames such contrasts as moments of exposure rather than surprise. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth. Genesis records, not as an instant catastrophe, but as a process that revealed where trust had been placed. Genesis 7:17. Isaiah echoes the theme from another angle. The earth dries up and withers. The earth lies defiled under its inhabitants. Isaiah 24:4-5. In both cases, the emphasis is not spectacle, but unveiling. The shipwreck at Lake Mead stands in quiet contrast to Noah's Ark. One was built to endure what was coming. The other was built for conditions assumed to last. When the water changed, the difference became visible. As the shoreline continues to pull back and the landscape grows barer, the question sharpens. It is no longer only about what the water reveals, but about where confidence is placed when the environment that once sustained everything quietly moves away. While water continues to withdraw in the west, a very different signal has emerged beneath the ground in the south. In Florida, the land itself began to fail not with an explosion, but with a slow, deliberate collapse. A massive sinkhole opened without warning, drawing an entire cypress forest inward. The swamp's once glassy surface broke apart as trees leaned, snapped, and vanished below, leaving behind open water where dense green canopy had stood. Spanish moss still hung from nearby branches, unmoving, framing a landscape that suddenly felt hollowed out. Nearby, another detail troubled observers even more. Along the edges of adjacent marshland, the water surface began to bubble repeatedly, as if the earth were exhaling. The bubbling came and went, appearing in places where the water had long been still. Then came a moment after each collapse, when the area fell unnaturally quiet, broken only by low, distant rumbles rising from below. Monitoring equipment recorded deep vibrations, hollow booms, and a sustained roar beneath the surface, sounds that lingered rather than struck. Geologists point to the failure of a salt dome and the movement of trapped gas to explain the mechanics. These accounts describe the process, but they also acknowledge something rare. The activity originated from depths seldom exposed, zones usually stable and silent. The earth was not reacting at the surface, it was responding from below. Scripture describes such moments with unsettling precision. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them, and they went down alive into the pit. Numbers 16:32-33. In biblical language, when the ground gives way, it is not portrayed as random failure, but as revelation, hidden supports exposed, assumed stability withdrawn. Florida follows this pattern. The land did not erupt outward, it yielded inward, quietly and persistently. A reminder that upheaval does not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes it begins when the ground simply stops holding what it once sustained. Placed alongside the retreating waters of Lake Mead, the contrast sharpens. In the west, water pulls back and uncovers what people relied on. In the south, the earth opens and absorbs what once stood firm. One reveals through absence, the other removes through collapse. Creation, in Scripture, is never silent without reason. When ground sinks and sealed layers rupture, the message is not panic but attention. If what lies beneath can no longer remain hidden, the question presses forward. What foundations have we assumed were permanent, and why are they being exposed now? While conditions shift turbulently, Missouri has entered a chapter that feels increasingly unfamiliar. Not because winter storms are rare, but because of how this one behaves. Cold pressed deeper and lingered longer than expected, settling over regions more accustomed to mild seasonal swings. Snow reached lower elevations, wind carved through valleys. Frost held its ground well past sunrise. The landscape itself seemed caught off guard. This was not cold arriving gently. It arrived with weight. Mountain passes stayed sealed beneath ice. Hills normally green in winter took on a brittle, silver tone. Along river banks, snow dusted ridgelines where it seldom remains, reshaping familiar horizons into something briefly unrecognizable. What made this storm unsettling was not a single extreme, but its persistence. Meteorologists pointed to complex atmospheric patterns and displaced jet streams, explanations that describe the mechanics but not the experience. This cold did not behave like a normal front. It stalled, reinforced itself, and deepened. In Scripture, prolonged cold is not merely weather. It is often framed as a sign of restraint and authority. The book of Job speaks plainly. By the breath of God, frost is given, and the broad waters are frozen fast. Job 37:10. Cold and release are depicted not as accidents, but as instruments held and released with intention. This storm did not announce itself with spectacle. It revealed itself through endurance, through a landscape held in suspension, through cold that asked how prepared the land truly was when conditions stopped behaving as expected. The question Missouri now faces is not whether this storm will lose strength, but what it means when severity replaces rhythm, and restraint lingers longer than familiarity allows. When cold holds its ground, what is it asking us to notice before it lets go? Before we continue, like this video, subscribe, and stay with us as we explore what may come next now. After warnings seemed to rise from the natural world itself, attention shifted to a place defined by quiet. Inside a church, amid still air and unmoving stone, worshippers described a moment that unsettled them in ways they struggled to explain. During prayer, a statue of Christ appeared to change. The eyes seemed to open wider. The lips, long fixed in silence, appeared to part not enough to speak, but enough to suggest intention. Those present described a physical reaction before any thought formed, a tightening in the chest. Several said the room felt heavier, as if sound itself had thinned. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. The instinct was not excitement, but restraint. People stayed where they were, unsure whether to look again or look away. What gave the event its weight was how ordinary it was. There was no announcement, no spectacle, no attempt to draw attention. The movement was slight, almost reluctant, recorded quietly on phones during worship. It did not demand belief. It invited uncertainty. This occurred at a time when many churches across the country have grown quieter. Sanctuaries once full now echo. Faith, for many, has retreated into habit rather than expectation. Outside, the world feels loud with disruption. Inside, silence has become familiar. That contrast made the moment harder to dismiss. The Old Testament often frames God's communication not through force, but through subtle disturbance in familiar places. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it, Jacob says, after awakening from a dream. Genesis 28-16. Elsewhere, the prophet Elijah learns that the presence of God is not in wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. Recognition comes not from volume, but from attentiveness. The statue did not deliver words, it offered no instruction, and perhaps that is the point. In Scripture, signs are not always explanations. They are invitations to examine posture, awareness, and timing. The question left behind is not what was said, but why it was felt. Why that quiet shift stirred unease rather than comfort. And why, in a place built for certainty, the moment introduced pause instead. When something familiar changes just enough to be noticed, the ancient question returns. Are we watching closely, or only assuming we already know what we're seeing? Across the United States, weather no longer follows the patterns people once trusted. What used to unfold gradually by season, by forecast, now arrives abruptly, forcefully, and without respecting boundaries. Twin tornadoes touch down within minutes of one another. Vast regions slip into whiteout conditions without warning. Cold snaps strike out of season, while sudden surges of water move through places long thought secure or dry. Events once described as rare are no longer separated by years. They are stacking. Storm after storm, freeze after flood, heat yields to snow, then returns again. Geography no longer insulates, and calendars no longer reassure. In a single week, one region burns while another is buried. Meteorologists cite jet stream distortion, ocean warming, and atmospheric instability. These explain the mechanics but not the compression. Extremes are not just stronger, they are overlapping, arriving almost in unison, as if nature has stopped taking turns. And then, just as suddenly as it arrives, there is silence. In many places, witnesses describe a brief stillness after the system passes. Wind drops off sharply, rain stops all at once, birds vanish, and even traffic noise seems muted. It lasts only moments, but it feels imposed rather than natural, like a held breath before movement resumes. Scripture gives language to this kind of moment. Jesus spoke of upheaval across nations and creation, describing them as birth pains, events that grow closer together and more intense. The Old Testament echoes this progression. I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall move out of its place. Isaiah 13:13. Not chaos without meaning, but pressure before change. What stands out now is timing. These events arrive where preparation is thin, and recovery windows vanish quickly. Systems strain not from one disaster, but from many. In the biblical view, disorder is not meant to provoke panic, but awareness. When creation grows restless, it signals attention is required. So the question is no longer how extreme the storms have become, but what this acceleration is preparing us for. And whether anyone is listening before the next silence breaks. Before we continue, like this video, subscribe, and stay with us as we explore what may come next now. As storms intensify and seasons lose their familiar rhythm, attention turns upward. After the earth shakes, water overruns its bounds, and cold arrives without warning. The sky itself begins to draw notice. Across the United States, people report unusual cloud formations, strange lights, and lingering patterns, overhead features that seem to stay just long enough to be remembered, not dismissed. These are not isolated images or a single viral moment. Witnesses in different states capture remarkably similar scenes. Clouds arranging into precise geometries, vertical light pillars appearing where no storms are present, faint arcs glowing across darkened skies. Some appear during severe thunderstorms. Others surface around eclipses or during periods of extreme weather, when the atmosphere feels stretched. What deepens the impact is how differently people experience the same sight. One witness describes calm and unexpected peace. Another reports unease, a tightening in the chest. Others feel wonder, mixed with discomfort, as if beauty and warning occupy the same space. The sky does not produce a single emotion. It reflects the inner state of those who look up. Then, there is a pause brief, unmistakable. In the moments after these displays fade, several witnesses note a sudden quiet. Wind slackens, ambient noise thins, and the horizon feels emptied. It lasts only seconds, but it feels imposed rather than natural, as though the sky has finished speaking and stepped back. Scientists point to atmospheric optics and physics, ice crystals, refraction, electrical effects, rare cloud dynamics. These explain how such phenomena can occur. They do not explain why they are appearing with such frequency now, or why they cluster around moments of upheaval below. Scripture has long suggested an order to such signs. Acts 2:19 says, I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below. The sequence matters. The Old Testament echoes this role of the sky as witness. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands. Psalm 19:1. And again, I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth. Joel 2:30. These are not spectacles for awe alone, but markers meant to be noticed. What makes this moment distinct is how easily these signs are overlooked. Cameras record them, screens display them, yet many scroll past. As storms multiply and the ground grows unstable, attention fragments and awareness thins. The Bible does not frame such signs as entertainment. They invite reflection, not panic readiness, not speculation discernment. After the storms, after the floods, after the shaking earth, The sky offers its testimony. It does not compel belief. It presents itself. The question, then, is no longer whether the signs are visible, but whether anyone is still looking up and willing to weigh what these quiet signals might be asking of those who see them. As signs linger in the skies and strange shows itself in the ground, attention turns once more to the waters. After floods redraw shorelines and receding reservoirs expose what had long been hidden, reports begin to surface from rivers, lakes, and coastlines across the United States. Brief, unsettling images circulate unfamiliar shapes, breaking the surface. Forms that seem out of place, difficult to identify, and gone almost as soon as they appear. These sightings are not confined to one location or a single moment. They emerge from inland rivers swollen by runoff, from lakes left shallow and murky, and from coastal waters stirred by storms. Some appear thrashing near the surface for seconds. Others are glimpsed along muddy banks after waters retreat. In nearly every case, the encounter is fleeting. The water closes again, leaving only footage, ripples, and questions behind. What stands out is how differently each witness reacts. One describes shock, an instinctive step backward. Another reports curiosity, even awe. Some feel fear, others a strange calm. A few speak of discomfort without being able to explain why, as if the sight unsettled something deeper than reason. The same image produces no single response, only a shared sense that what was seen did not belong where or when it appeared. And then, almost without fail, the water stills. Several recordings capture a brief quiet immediately afterward. The surface smoothing, movement slowing, sound thinning. It lasts only moments, but it feels deliberate, as though whatever surfaced has withdrawn and the boundary has closed again. Biologists and experts suggest familiar explanations. Misidentified species, displaced deep-water animals, rare organisms forced upward by changing conditions, yet many recordings resist easy classification. The issue is not simply appearance, but timing. These sightings increase as waters warm, surge, and recede when underwater environments are disturbed and long stable layers are unsettled. Floods churn riverbeds. Storm surges reshape coastlines. Drought lowers water lines, exposing depths that once remained concealed. In each case, the separation between deep and surface weakens. The waters no longer hold what they once contained. Scripture gives language to this pattern. Revelation 20:13 states, "The sea gave up the dead that were in it." The emphasis is not on what emerges, but on the act of release. The Old Testament echoes this imagery of the deep, yielding what it holds. The springs of the deep burst forth. Genesis 7:11. A phrase that speaks not of randomness, but of restraint, giving way. Throughout the Bible, the deep is portrayed as a place of containment. It conceals, restrains, and waits. When it releases what has been held, it signals transition, not necessarily destruction, but exposure. Testimony. What makes this moment difficult to ignore is its alignment with wider disruption. As weather patterns fracture, land destabilizes, and the sky displays unfamiliar signs, the waters respond in kind. Creation does not react in isolation. One domain stirs, and the others answer. Scripture presents creation as interconnected. When one part groans, the rest do not remain silent. The waters yielding their hidden contents fits this pattern not as an anomaly, but as part of a sequence. The Bible does not demand that every creature be named or explained. It asks a different question. When the deep begins to give up what it once concealed, the issue is not classification, but timing. Why now? Why, as waters warm, flood, and withdraw. Why? As signs multiply across land and sky. The creatures themselves may remain unexplained, but their appearance coincides with a moment of global disturbance that grows harder to dismiss. In the biblical view, the deep does not speak with words. It speaks by release. And when it does, it is meant to draw attention not toward fear of what surfaces, but toward the realization that the boundaries holding the world together are under pressure. The waters are no longer quiet, and what they are giving up suggests that something long restrained is being allowed to surface deliberately, and for a reason. Are these isolated disasters, or signs of something larger taking shape? Science continues to gather data, map trends, and refine explanations. Yet Scripture approaches moments like this from a much older lens, one concerned not only with cause, but with meaning. The Bible repeatedly warns of a season when signs would no longer arrive quietly or alone, but together, layered, accelerating, and increasingly difficult to dismiss. What is striking in this moment is how differently people experience it. Some describe unease they can't quite name. Others feel urgency, as if time itself has tightened. A few report calm, even clarity, while many simply feel disoriented, aware that something is changing, but unsure how to respond. The same events produce fear in one observer, reflection in another, and denial in a third. The signs are shared, the reactions are not. And then there is the pause, a brief, collective stillness that follows each wave of disruption. After the storm passes, after the ground settles, there is often a moment where nothing moves, and people sense not relief, but expectancy. In Luke 21, Jesus describes a time when distress among nations would grow, when the sea and waves would roar, and when people would feel fear and confusion about what is coming upon the world. He does not point to a single catastrophe, but to a condition, a season marked by instability and anticipation. The emphasis is not on one event, but on the atmosphere created when many occur together. The prophets spoke in the same cadence. Isaiah warned that the earth would be broken, split apart, and violently shaken, not as a sudden end, but as the result of accumulated weight. Isaiah 24-19. Amos spoke of rain withheld in one place and poured out in another. So people would wander, searching for water and understanding, yet still not turn back. Amos 4-7. 8. These were not random acts, but measured signs meant to provoke reflection. Paul later writes that creation itself groans, as if in labor, waiting for what is to be revealed. That imagery matters. Groaning is not destruction, it is pressure before emergence. Labor pains are not the child, but they announce that the moment is drawing near. Scripture consistently frames upheaval this way, not as chaos without purpose, but as preparation. Timing is central to the biblical warnings. Ecclesiastes reminds us that there is a time for every purpose under heaven. Revelation speaks of seals opened in sequence, not all at once. Even judgment unfolds in stages. The Bible does not present the end as sudden confusion, but as a deliberate unfolding in which humanity is repeatedly given space to see, to hear, and to respond. That is why the question is no longer whether something is happening. That feels increasingly evident. The deeper question is why now? Why do signs appear across land, sea, and sky at the same time? Why does instability reach systems once considered secure? Why do ancient warnings feel newly relevant in a world saturated with technology and information? Scripture suggests such moments test foundations. Jesus' parable of the wise and foolish builders does not focus on the storm both houses face it. The difference lies in what they were built upon. Storms do not create weakness. They reveal it. Pressure does not invent truth. It exposes it. The Bible never urges fear in response to signs. It calls for awareness, watchfulness, readiness. Again and again, the instruction is not to panic, but to stay alert, because signs are meant to awaken, not overwhelm. If Scripture is correct, then this season is not about predicting dates or assigning blame. It is about discernment, about recognizing that history moves in seasons, and some seasons carry warnings meant to be taken seriously. Science will continue to explain mechanisms. Data will keep accumulating. But Scripture addresses the heart of the matter. When signs multiply and order gives way to unrest, the invitation is to look beyond explanations and ask a more personal question. Not what is happening, but where do we stand when it does? Because in the biblical view, signs are never given without purpose, and when they appear together, they are not meant to entertain curiosity, but to call people back to what truly endures. Proverbs records wisdom speaking with urgency. Because I have called and you refused, I will laugh at your calamity. Proverbs 1:24-26. The tone is not cruelty, but urgency. There comes a moment when warnings shift from invitation to consequence. Discernment, Scripture teaches, is time-sensitive. Hosea describes a people who mistook stability for approval, continuing to plant and build, while the ground beneath them was already marked for shaking. Hosea 8-7. Zephaniah warns of those who say, "The Lord will do nothing," only to discover that complacency itself was the danger. Zephaniah 1:12. Jesus' parables reinforce the same truth. The servants who were ready were not those who predicted the master's return, but those who lived as if it mattered. Lamps filled with oil mattered more than explanations. Readiness mattered more than knowledge. Throughout Scripture, signs are never the destination. They are signals pointing toward decision. And when the Bible speaks of final days, it does not ask humanity to solve mysteries, but to choose faithfulness while the door remains open. Because in the end, Scripture makes one thing clear. Warnings are evidence of patience, not delay. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and keep an eye out for our next video. Leave a comment and let us know what you think. Something unusual is unfolding across the American landscape. In the middle of winter, wildfire ignited in Arizona, burning land set aside for protection rather than risk. Soon after, heavy rain followed the flames, turning relief into disruption as scorched soil struggled to absorb water. Near Sedona, normally silent red rock formations drew attention when faint. Low vibrations were detected beneath the ground. Along the California coast, rare deep-sea creatures surfaced in shallow waters, appearing far from the depths they typically inhabit. Fire, water, land, and sea seemed to respond in sequence, almost in conversation. It began with a wildfire that spread across more than 4,000 acres inside a protected wildlife preserve. This was not peak summer heat, but winter. In some areas, ash settled onto cold ground that still held traces of frost, a detail firefighters noted as both unusual and troubling. The fire moved quickly, crossing boundaries long considered stable, challenging assumptions about when and where such events belong. Then came the shift rain falling on freshly burned slopes, sending dark runoff into dry washes and reminding observers how quickly one extreme can give way to another. What made this fire stand out was not only its scale, but its timing. Seasons that once acted as buffers no longer seemed to hold their lines. While winter storms affected other regions, fire advanced here, eroding confidence in the rhythms people depend on. In Scripture, fire often appears as a precursor rather than a conclusion. Fire goes before him and burns up his adversaries all around. Psalm 97:3, speaks of fire as movement, something that arrives ahead of change. Another ancient warning echoes this theme. For behold, the Lord will come in fire, to render his anger with fury. Isaiah 66:15, emphasizing not randomness, but purpose. The setting matters. A wildlife refuge symbolizes care, stewardship, and long-term protection. When fire reaches even these places, it exposes how provisional human safeguards can be. This does not assign meaning to the fire itself. It invites attention. When familiar patterns fail and elements respond out of season, Scripture urges reflection rather than fear. Fire reveals what withstands heat and what does not. When fire appears where and when it should not, the question becomes simple and searching. Are we noticing the changes taking place around us, or are we still trusting rhythms that no longer hold? In the wake of wildfire, an unusually intense rainstorm descends, one experts describe as statistically rare, far beyond seasonal norms. Rainfall totals climb rapidly, overwhelming slopes that only days earlier had been stripped bare by flames. What was expected to soothe the land instead accelerates exposure, revealing how fragile the surface has become. Under ordinary conditions, rain restores. It cools scorched soil, feeds roots, and signals renewal. But fire alters the ground in lasting ways. Heat can fuse fine particles into a hardened layer, creating a water-repellent skin just beneath the surface. When rain arrives, it cannot sink in. It sheets downhill instead, pulling ash, charcoal, and loosened earth into fast-moving flows. Channels that were dry hours earlier fill abruptly. What should have nourished now uncovers weakness. Then the land responds quickly, decisively, without warning. Rills carve into slopes. Debris fans spread at the base of hillsides. The water does not linger. It exposes and moves on. Scripture often assigns water this dual role. It is blessing, yet it is also testing. In the days of Noah, rain came after long patience not to surprise, but to reveal. When it fell, it did more than water the earth. It exposed what had been built to endure and what had not. The pattern is named plainly. I also withheld the rain from you when there were yet 3 months to the harvest. I would send rain on one city and send no rain on another. Amos 4-7. Timing and reception matter. Rain is not random. Its effect depends on what lies beneath. Here, heavy rain following fire shows how quickly help becomes trial when foundations are compromised. The water has not changed. The ground has. When the earth can no longer receive what is meant to restore it, exposure follows instead of growth. Fire first. Then, rain. Not chaos, but sequence. Together, they reveal what remains below the surface. The question is not whether rain is good or bad. The deeper question is whether the ground is prepared to receive it. When rain can no longer sink into the soil and instead races across the surface, the situation crosses a threshold. What follows is no longer a flood in the ordinary sense. High on the slopes, water accelerates, scooping up ash, loosened earth, fractured stone, and uprooted trees. What began as runoff consolidates into a dense, fast-moving mass, more wall than stream, surging downhill with sudden force. This kind of event is distinct because it is never driven by one cause alone. Water does not act independently. The ground has already been weakened. Heat has fractured rock. Roots that once stitched soil together are gone. Saturation removes friction. Then gravity takes over. The result is a chain reaction. Slopes liquefy, channels reroute, and the landscape is reshaped in moments rather than over generations. A telling detail often appears just before the surge. Small stones begin to click and roll on the surface, followed by a low, rushing sound that grows rapidly louder. It is the warning many describe as lasting only seconds, the brief moment when solid ground gives way to motion. In the natural order, each element has its role. Water moves, earth bears weight, stone anchors. When those roles collapse into one another, balance fails. Scripture treats such moments as meaningful. Creation is portrayed not as random, but as ordered, and when order breaks, it signals distress rather than chance. The New Testament captures this tension, for we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth. Romans 8:22. Groaning implies pressure, not instant ruin strain, building toward an outcome not yet revealed. The Old Testament echoes the same warning in physical terms. The earth is utterly broken. The earth is split apart. The earth is violently shaken. Isaiah 24-19. The language is cumulative. One fracture leads to another. Collapse follows preparation. Debris flows make this sequence visible. Fire weakens the land. Rain overwhelms it. Gravity completes the release. Each stage prepares the next. Nothing happens in isolation. What unsettles most is the speed. There is little margin for response. Ground that appeared firm moments earlier begins to move. Familiar terrain becomes hazardous without ceremony. It is not only water, and it is not only land. It is the system acting together. And when creation responds as a whole, Scripture suggests it is meant to be noticed, not to provoke panic, but to remind us how thin the line is between stability and collapse. After fire, intense rainfall, and shifting ground reshape the surface. Attention turns downward. Near Sedona, Arizona, an area defined by exposed sandstone and deep faulted layers, interest has returned to a network of caves and subsurface chambers. Some openings have become visible only after erosion stripped away thin layers of soil. Others were long known, but are now being reconsidered as fresh reports emerge. What draws notice is not what can be seen, but what can be sensed. Visitors describe low, steady vibrations traveling through the rock, too consistent to be wind, too localized to be traffic, and too deep to trace to surface activity. The sound is not loud. It does not echo. It presses inward, felt more than heard, as if the stone itself is carrying tension. Above ground, the air is still. Below, the rock does not feel at rest. One small but telling detail is often mentioned. Loose grains of sand near cave entrances slowly shift and settle on their own, as if responding to motion deeper inside. Nothing collapses, nothing breaks. Yet the ground subtly rearranges itself. Sedona has long been linked to reports of unusual sensations, areas where people describe pressure, dizziness, or a heightened awareness. Science debates interpretation, but the repetition of similar accounts keeps focus on the region. Unlike floods or fires, there is no visible crisis here. The disturbance is contained, internal, and quiet. In Scripture, caves appear during moments of fear, testing, and warning. Isaiah writes, "People will flee to caves in the rocks and to holes in the ground from the terror of the Lord." Isaiah 2:19. The passage is not about geology, but about response, what people do when stability above ground feels uncertain. Another ancient line deepens the image. "In his hand are the depths of the earth." Psalm 95:4. The verse reminds readers that what lies below is not empty or inert, but held, measured, and known. This is what makes the timing matter. As disruptions intensify across the surface, attention shifts inward, not because answers are found underground, but because uncertainty drives retreat. Silence above does not guarantee calm below. These caves do not announce an ending. They suggest pressure. A reminder that beneath landscapes that appear unchanged, forces can move unseen. And when Scripture speaks of people turning toward the earth for refuge, it is not offering safety. It is warning that the ground itself may soon demand attention. Before we move on, please give us a like and subscribe to support us. Every contribution helps. Thanks so much. Along the California coast, rare oarfish, long, ribbon-like creatures that normally dwell thousands of feet below the surface, have been found washed ashore. These fish inhabit deep pelagic zones where sunlight never reaches and pressure is extreme. They are adapted to darkness and stillness, not surf and sand. Under normal conditions, they remain unseen for an entire lifetime. What makes these appearances unsettling is not only the species, but the pattern. Oarfish sightings are typically separated by decades, yet now they are appearing repeatedly, sometimes within the same season, in waters far shallower than their biology allows for comfort or survival. In several cases, their bodies showed no obvious injury from nets or vessels. One detail noted by shoreline monitors stands out. Many of the fish arrived during periods of relatively calm seas, when wave action was minimal and tides were stable. Nothing on the surface appeared violent enough to force something from such depth upward, yet the deep released it anyway. Marine scientists point to possible explanations: warming layers that alter oxygen levels, shifting currents, or pressure changes along underwater fault systems. These theories describe mechanisms, but not timing. They explain how ascent might occur, not why the deep seems less willing to hold what it once concealed. The ocean, long treated as distant and stable, appears increasingly restless, its boundaries less absolute. In ancient understanding, the sea represented what was hidden, uncontrollable, and restrained. When creatures of the deep emerged, it signaled disruption below the surface. Scripture echoes this imagery. While Jesus spoke of the roaring of the sea and the waves, Luke 21:25, the Old Testament adds another layer. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Psalm 89:9. The verse frames the sea not as chaos without limit, but as something held until it is allowed to move. The ocean does not announce change with words. It signals through release, through motion, through what it no longer keeps hidden. When creatures designed for the abyss appear at the edge of the land, attention naturally turns downward. These moments are not presented in Scripture as reasons for panic, but for awareness. When the sea gives up what it normally conceals, it invites reflection. It suggests that unseen layers are being disturbed, and that what once remained far below is being drawn closer to view. The question is not what these creatures are. The deeper question is why the ocean is yielding them now, and what this stirring beneath the surface is preparing the world to notice. As the sea gives up what it once concealed, attention shifts away from moving waters to something far more still. When signs rise from the depths, Scripture often turns the eye toward what was already planted silent, enduring, and waiting to be recognized. In New Mexico, carved into a dark basalt hillside, an ancient stone continues to provoke questions that time has not answered. The Los Lunas Decalogue stone bears inscriptions closely resembling ancient Hebrew text associated with the Ten Commandments. The characters are cut deep into volcanic rock basalt, so dense that even modern tools struggle to mark it cleanly. This was not a casual carving. The grooves show consistent depth and direction, suggesting deliberate effort over extended time. Whoever carved the text expected wind, heat, and erosion, and carved anyway. One small but telling detail often overlooked is its orientation. The stone faces outward toward the valley below, exposed to sun, rain, and temperature extremes year after year. It was not hidden to be discovered later. It was placed to remain visible, whether noticed or ignored. Scholars continue to debate its origin. Some argue for ancient transoceanic contact, others for a later inscription. No single conclusion has settled the discussion. Yet, the debate itself reveals something crucial. The message has endured. Regardless of when the letters were cut, the content remains unmistakable. Law, not ornament. Instruction, not myth. In Scripture, law carved in stone carries particular weight. The commandments given to Moses were not written on cloth or spoken only once. They were engraved into tablets, underscoring permanence and accountability. Stone does not adapt. It does not negotiate. It stands while cultures rise and fall. As Deuteronomy 27:8 commands, write very clearly all the words of this law on these stones. Clarity and durability were the point. That symbolism becomes striking when set within the American landscape. A nation built on ideals of liberty and self-determination now openly wrestles with moral authority and shared truth. In that context, a stone bearing ancient law fixed into the land feels less like a curiosity and more like a reminder, quiet, firm, and unmoved by modern debate. Scripture anticipates such moments. Habakkuk 2:11 declares, "The stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork will respond." The verse speaks not of sound, but of testimony. When words are ignored and warnings multiply, what has been silent begins to speak simply by remaining. Unlike signs in the sky or disturbances in nature, this stone does not shift. It does not roar or collapse. It waits. In a season when waters stir and ground trembles, something immovable draws attention back to covenant, responsibility, and boundaries that do not change with circumstance. The deeper question is not whether the stone proves ancient contact. The question is, why? Amid so many signs, attention keeps returning to written law. When creation moves and the deep releases what it held, Scripture often redirects the gaze to what was established long ago. If nature warns and the sea releases, the stone reminds. It stands as a quiet contrast to upheaval, unshaken, unadjusted, and uninterested in argument. And in a world searching for meaning in motion, an unmoving stone bearing ancient commands may be asking whether what was forgotten is now being brought back into view. After a series of unusual events in nature, attention shifts to something quieter and far more personal. Across different regions and backgrounds, ordinary people report having strikingly similar dreams. These accounts come from children, working adults, and the elderly people who do not know one another and share neither schedules, beliefs, nor sources of information. What stands out is not a single dream, but the convergence. Many describe recurring impressions: urgency without panic, awareness without instruction, a sense that something familiar is changing. Some recall vivid images. Others remember little more than a heavy emotion that lingered after waking. A small but telling detail appears again and again. Many say they woke suddenly in the early morning hours, heart racing, the room silent, sleep unable to return, and then nothing more was given. These experiences are not tied to churches, movements, or shared teaching. There is no coordinated message, no call to action being circulated. Several people say they had not been thinking about spiritual matters at all beforehand. The dreams arrived quietly, leaving questions rather than conclusions. Scripture gives language to this pattern. Joel 2:28 declares, "Your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions." The emphasis is breadth, not hierarchy. Insight is not reserved for leaders or institutions, but touches ordinary lives. Job adds further clarity. For God speaks again and again, in a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on people. Job 33-14:15. The passage suggests persistence, not spectacle. Throughout the Old Testament, dreams often appear at turning points. They rarely explain outcomes in advance. Instead, they invite attentiveness. Understanding comes later, sometimes much later. The purpose is not prediction, but preparation. What makes the current reports notable is their independence. When similar themes emerge without coordination, they resist easy dismissal as suggestion or trend. These are not identical stories, but they move in the same direction toward reflection, self-examination, and the quiet sense that established patterns may no longer hold. Importantly, these dreams offer no timelines or commands. They do not instruct. They unsettle gently. This aligns with Scripture's treatment of such moments as invitations to pause rather than proclamations to obey. Ecclesiastes reminds us, God gives dreams to keep them occupied. Ecclesiastes 5-7, pointing not to certainty, but to humility. In a world saturated with noise, dreams operate differently. They are private. They cannot be fact-checked or shared fully. They linger in the mind long after waking. That subtlety makes them easy to ignore yet difficult to forget. The Bible frames moments like these as opportunities, not conclusions. Not everything meaningful arrives with force or clarity. Some things surface within, asking for patience instead of reaction. The question, then, is not whether every dream means the same thing. It is whether the growing number of similar experiences points to a shared moment of inward awareness. When the world outside shifts and something inside begins to stir, Scripture does not call for fear, but for careful listening, discernment, and wisdom. Throughout the Bible, revelation is rarely portrayed as a single moment of shock. It is shown as a process slow, deliberate, and unavoidable. What is hidden is not exposed all at once, but uncovered layer by layer, until what was concealed can no longer remain in shadow. Scripture consistently affirms that concealment is temporary, while truth endures. Jesus stated this plainly. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. This principle extends beyond words and actions. It reaches into creation itself. In the biblical view, nature is not passive. The earth, the sea, and the heavens act as witnesses, responding when truth is ready to surface. Revelation often begins quietly. Before major turning points, subtle exposures occur, motives clarified, foundations tested, priorities revealed. In Daniel, sealed words remained closed until the appointed time. In Revelation, seals are removed one by one, not together. Disclosure follows order, not impulse. Exposure rarely announces itself. It arrives when attention is elsewhere. This same pattern applies to human life. Scripture teaches that what remains unseen within thoughts, loyalties, hidden attachments, eventually rises to the surface. Pressure reveals what comfort conceals. Light uncovers what darkness protected. This is not framed as punishment, but as clarity. Ecclesiastes echoes this certainty. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether good or evil. Ecclesiastes 12:14. Importantly, Revelation is not confined to sacred spaces. The Bible shows truth emerging through ordinary circumstances, disruptions to routine, and unexpected moments, sometimes through nature, sometimes through reflection, sometimes through events that quietly unsettle. Revelation is less about spectacle and more about alignment, bringing what is hidden into agreement with what is true. When Scripture speaks of a day of revelation, it does not describe only a distant future. It also points to seasons when exposure increases, when patterns become visible, and excuses lose weight. In such times, the call is not fear, but humility, not denial, but wisdom. Light in the Bible is not meant to destroy. It is meant to guide, correct, and invite change, while change is still possible. Revelation is mercy before finality. If hidden things are now coming into view in the world and within human hearts, the message of Scripture remains consistent. This is a moment to reflect, to realign, and to walk honestly. Not everything revealed demands immediate action, but everything revealed invites response. The day of revelation is not about accusation. It is about truth becoming visible, so that what endures may remain, and what does not can finally be released. Social Media Ministries presents the final installment in a series examining biblical prophecy and the closing period of human history as described in Scripture. This concluding section centers on what the book of Daniel identifies as the fourth beast, an alliance unlike any before it, forming not through conquest alone, but through convergence. Major powers across Europe and Asia move toward coordination, creating a structure that does not resemble past empires in shape or behavior. According to this interpretation, Great Britain, Russia, nations drawn into Russian influence, and Germany form the core of this final configuration. France and additional allied states are understood to lend support, producing a coalition broad in reach, yet fractured in unity. Scripture describes this final empire as fundamentally different, strong, divided, and driven by control rather than coherence. What appears unified on the surface is internally unstable. This alliance is believed to pursue a singular objective: the suppression of faith rooted in the God of Abraham. Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all trace their origin to Abraham, yet they are not opposed in the same way. Judaism and Islam, closely tied to identifiable ethnic and cultural frameworks, are viewed as easier to isolate. Christianity, however, spread across nations, languages, and cultures, proves harder to contain. Its lack of geographic boundaries makes it uniquely resistant. As a result, biblical prophecy describes opposition to Christianity as especially severe, not localized, but systemic, not temporary, but sustained. Daniel chapter 7 portrays this power as terrifying and crushing, consuming authority and influence without restraint. The threat is not only physical, it is ideological. Faith that refuses alignment becomes a liability. A very real detail often overlooked is how modern systems already reward compliance over conscience through digital access, economic participation, and social legitimacy. These pressures mirror, in early form, the mechanisms Scripture describes as tools of allegiance rather than weapons of war. Daniel's visions emphasize timing as much as power. If believers remain during this phase, Scripture suggests their endurance will be tested under compressed conditions. Interpretations differ regarding protection and removal, yet all agree on one point: this period represents unprecedented pressure on faith. To understand this framework, Scripture must be read as a whole. Daniel chapter 2 outlines a sequence of kingdoms ending in a divided final power. Daniel chapters 7 and 8 expand the imagery through beasts and horns, representing authority and rebellion. Revelation develops this further, describing global systems that oppose God and demand allegiance. Revelation chapters 12 through 14 reveal the spiritual dimension beneath political movement. The conflict is not only between nations, but between truth and deception, affecting cultures, institutions, and individual conscience. Allegiance becomes the dividing line. Genesis also plays a role. The divisions among Abraham's descendants in Genesis chapters 16 and 21 are presented as seeds of long-standing conflict. What began as personal decisions echoes through history and reappears in final alignments. Scripture consistently shows that unresolved foundations eventually resurface. This message is not presented to provoke fear, but awareness. Prophecy prepares, it does not paralyze. While the fourth beast is described as powerful, Scripture is clear that its authority is limited. The Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Daniel 4:17. Power operates only within boundaries set by God. The Old Testament reinforces this certainty. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. Daniel 2:21. History is not random. Kingdoms rise and fall within a framework of accountability. The final outcome in Scripture is not collapse, but restoration. Earthly systems pass, but God's purposes endure. Prophecy points beyond fear toward faithfulness, calling believers to wisdom, endurance, and trust not in political strength, but in God alone. As this series concludes, the focus returns to personal responsibility. Faith is not proven in comfort, but in pressure. The imagery of beasts and empires may feel distant, but the call is immediate. Remain discerning, remain grounded, remain faithful. This final message invites reflection rather than speculation. It encourages careful study, humility, and purposeful living. While global structures shift, the invitation of Scripture remains unchanged. Choose truth, endure with hope, and trust God above all else. Prophecy, rightly understood, strengthens community rather than dividing it. It reminds believers to support one another through teaching, prayer, and service. Endurance is shared. Hope is collective. Faith is lived daily, quietly, faithfully, even as uncertainty presses in across generations, cultures, and moments of history. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and keep an eye out for our next video. Leave a comment and let us know what you think. Across America, foundations are being tested in very different ways. Water is retreating from Lake Mead, exposing a rusted shipwreck that had remained hidden for decades. At the same time, the ground itself has given way in Florida, where the surroundings have been pulled downward as the land collapses inward. In the Midwest, an unusually severe winter storm has swept through Missouri, driving cold deep into regions unaccustomed to prolonged freezes. And in quiet churches, familiar statues appear to shift just enough to unsettle those watching. These stories never share a headline, but timing connects them. When so many supports are being adjusted at once, the question is unavoidable. What do they truly mean? Before we continue, like this video, share your thoughts, and subscribe, because what's unfolding may matter more than we realize. Across the American Southwest, a symbolic scene continues to take shape. Lake Mead, once a lifeline for millions, has receded to levels not seen since the 1930s. Prolonged drought and rising heat have drawn the shoreline steadily inward, leaving behind a stark, chalky bathtub ring etched high along canyon walls. Sun-bleached rock, cracked sediment, and long-buried debris now dominate a landscape that was once defined by water. As the lake withdraws, Objects sealed beneath its surface for decades are revealed. Among them, a corroded shipwreck rests on exposed ground, its hull tilted and rusting in open air. The vessel did not break apart in a storm. It was not destroyed by force. The water simply left, and in leaving, it exposed what time had already weakened. These ships once moved with purpose. They carried people, supported labor, and reflected confidence in continuity. Now they sit still on dry earth, unable to float, because the conditions that sustained them are gone. The water did not ruin them, it uncovered them. What once appeared dependable is shown to be fragile when the supporting element recedes. At the same time, other parts of the country experience the opposite extreme. While Lake Mead continues to contract, distant regions contend with persistent inundation, winter storms, sudden surges, and water pressing beyond familiar bounds. In one place, water withdraws. In another, it overwhelms. The contrast is striking. The same element revealing vulnerability through absence in one region and through excess in another. Scripture often frames such contrasts as moments of exposure rather than surprise. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth. Genesis records, not as an instant catastrophe, but as a process that revealed where trust had been placed. Genesis 7:17. Isaiah echoes the theme from another angle. The earth dries up and withers. The earth lies defiled under its inhabitants. Isaiah 24:4-5. In both cases, the emphasis is not spectacle, but unveiling. The shipwreck at Lake Mead stands in quiet contrast to Noah's Ark. One was built to endure what was coming. The other was built for conditions assumed to last. When the water changed, the difference became visible. As the shoreline continues to pull back and the landscape grows barer, the question sharpens. It is no longer only about what the water reveals, but about where confidence is placed when the environment that once sustained everything quietly moves away. While water continues to withdraw in the west, a very different signal has emerged beneath the ground in the south. In Florida, the land itself began to fail not with an explosion, but with a slow, deliberate collapse. A massive sinkhole opened without warning, drawing an entire cypress forest inward. The swamp's once glassy surface broke apart as trees leaned, snapped, and vanished below, leaving behind open water where dense green canopy had stood. Spanish moss still hung from nearby branches, unmoving, framing a landscape that suddenly felt hollowed out. Nearby, another detail troubled observers even more. Along the edges of adjacent marshland, the water surface began to bubble repeatedly, as if the earth were exhaling. The bubbling came and went, appearing in places where the water had long been still. Then came a moment after each collapse when the area fell unnaturally quiet, broken only by low, distant rumbles rising from below. Monitoring equipment recorded deep vibrations, hollow booms, and a sustained roar beneath the surface, sounds that lingered rather than struck. Geologists point to the failure of a salt dome and the movement of trapped gas to explain the mechanics. These accounts describe the process, but they also acknowledge something rare. The activity originated from depths seldom exposed, zones usually stable and silent. The earth was not reacting at the surface, it was responding from below. Scripture describes such moments with unsettling precision. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them, and they went down alive into the pit. Numbers 16:32-33. In biblical language, when the ground gives way, it is not portrayed as random failure, but as revelation, hidden supports exposed, assumed stability withdrawn. Florida follows this pattern. The land did not erupt outward, it yielded inward, quietly and persistently. A reminder that upheaval does not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes it begins when the ground simply stops holding what it once sustained. Placed alongside the retreating waters of Lake Mead, the contrast sharpens. In the west, water pulls back and uncovers what people relied on. In the south, the earth opens and absorbs what once stood firm. One reveals through absence, the other removes through collapse. Creation, in Scripture, is never silent without reason. When ground sinks and sealed layers rupture, the message is not panic but attention. If what lies beneath can no longer remain hidden, the question presses forward. What foundations have we assumed were permanent, and why are they being exposed now? While conditions shift turbulently, Missouri has entered a chapter that feels increasingly unfamiliar. Not because winter storms are rare, but because of how this one behaves. Cold pressed deeper and lingered longer than expected, settling over regions more accustomed to mild seasonal swings. Snow reached lower elevations, wind carved through valleys. Frost held its ground well past sunrise. The landscape itself seemed caught off guard. This was not cold arriving gently. It arrived with weight. Mountain passes stayed sealed beneath ice. Hills normally green in winter took on a brittle, silver tone. Along river banks, snow dusted ridgelines where it seldom remains, reshaping familiar horizons into something briefly unrecognizable. What made this storm unsettling was not a single extreme, but its persistence. Meteorologists pointed to complex atmospheric patterns and displaced jet streams, explanations that describe the mechanics but not the experience. This cold did not behave like a normal front. It stalled, reinforced itself, and deepened. In Scripture, prolonged cold is not merely weather. It is often framed as a sign of restraint and authority. The book of Job speaks plainly. By the breath of God, frost is given,